Welcome, my friend, to this quiet moment we now share, a gentle breath in the rush of life. Tonight, we're turning the pages of history to a chapter filled with darkness, drama, and aching humanity. A time far removed from ours, yet filled with emotions all too familiar. Whether you're tucking yourself in, resting after a long day, or simply searching for calm, I'm so glad you're here. If you're listening from across the globe, whatever your time zone, whatever your background, know that stories have always had the power to connect us, even across centuries. If this kind of slow, thoughtful journey through history soothes you, feel free to subscribe. We have many more quiet tales to carry us through the night. Now, let's begin with a modern frustration: dating. We all groan about it, swiping endlessly through apps, ghosting, awkward silences over overpriced coffee. But what if your biggest dating dilemma wasn't someone not texting you back, but whether your crush would live to see spring? What if asking for their hand meant literally asking their lord, because they were legally someone else's property? And what if, before falling in love, you had to make sure neither of you had recently been accused of heresy, or worse, witchcraft? It turns out dating in the Middle Ages was so nightmarish, so heartbreakingly cruel, that even our worst modern dating horror stories, those humiliating messages, those missed connections, feel almost romantic in comparison. Because back then, love wasn't just a struggle, it was nearly impossible. This was a world where love was considered a dangerous indulgence, marriage was a financial negotiation, and individual choice was barely part of the conversation, where most people had as much say in their romantic future as a sheep being bartered in the village square. And over the next few chapters, we'll explore exactly why that was. You'll see how the rigid class structure turned courtship into a strategic game, how the Catholic Church inserted itself into every aspect of intimacy, how disease, violence, and, yes, terrible hygiene made even the simplest romantic gesture fraught with peril. And here's what might surprise you: many of our most frustrating modern relationship problems, they didn't start with dating apps. They were born right here in this time of arranged marriages and candlelight pining. The pressure to marry young, that's a medieval legacy. The idea of relationships as alliances, that's straight out of feudal society. Even the belief that real love must be dramatic, painful, and hard to get. That myth was handcrafted by medieval poets, writing about impossible romances that were never meant to succeed. But let's begin at the very core of the problem. In medieval society, the concept of dating, as we know it, didn't exist. There was no getting to know each other, no flirtatious texts, no romantic dinner dates. Love wasn't about compatibility or chemistry, it was about family status, economic value, and survival. If you think your options feel limited now, try narrowing your dating pool to 50 people, all living in your village. Half of them are related to you, a quarter are already married, the rest, either too old, too young, or already promised to someone else. That was the reality for most people in medieval Europe, and unless you were a noble, your choices were not your own. For peasants, who made up about 90% of the population, romantic love was a luxury most couldn't afford. When your days are spent laboring from sunup to sundown, when a poor harvest could mean starvation, and when your landlord can control everything from your work to your movements, falling in love takes a back seat to staying alive. So most peasant marriages were arranged by families based on practical needs. Could the person carry heavy loads, plow a field, bring livestock or tools as a dowry? Were they healthy enough to survive childbirth or endure labor into their 30s? That was the measure of a good match. Romance wasn't just unnecessary, it was seen as dangerous, a distraction, a weakness, and even if two peasants managed to find genuine affection, it didn't guarantee marriage. Feudal lords held the legal right to approve or deny marriages among their serfs. That means if you were a skilled farmhand, your lord might forbid you from marrying someone in a neighboring village, because your leaving would impact his profit. And what about the nobility? Surely they had it better. Not exactly. If anything, things were worse, because love among nobles wasn't just discouraged, it was a direct threat to political stability. Noble marriages weren't about emotion, they were about strategy. Marriage was the tool used to forge alliances, secure borders, and prevent war. Daughters were tokens of diplomacy. Sons were pawns on a political chessboard. A noble girl might be promised to a man twice her age before she ever learned how to read. She might be sent off to another region, another kingdom, to marry a stranger whose family needed her father's soldiers or her mother's land. Her feelings weren't just ignored, they were irrelevant. Voicing objection could be seen as disobedience, or worse, treason. And this brings us to something even more disturbing. The concept of childhood, as we know it, didn't exist in the medieval mindset. Girls as young as 7 were often betrothed. Marriage contracts were signed before they reached puberty. And once a girl reached the so-called marriageable age, often as young as 12, consummation was expected. This wasn't a childhood crush turned sweet wedding. These were young girls, married to adult men, expected to bear children and manage households before they even understood their own bodies. A 12-year-old might be married to a man she met once, a man in his 30s, 40s, or older. She'd be responsible for running his home, pleasing his family, and birthing heirs, all while still being, by any honest measure, a child. The maternal mortality rates were devastating. Girls died in childbirth at horrifying rates, not just because medicine was primitive, but because their bodies were simply too young to survive pregnancy. And yet, they were pressured to keep trying until they delivered a male heir, or died in the process. Men didn't escape this nightmare either. Young noblemen were expected to marry not for love, but for alliance. If you weren't the eldest son, the one set to inherit, you might be pushed into the church whether or not you had a calling. That meant giving up the chance at marriage entirely. Goodbye romance, hello monastic silence. But here's the real twist. In the midst of all this control and cruelty, medieval society invented something wildly romantic. Courtly love. It was a poetic tradition. Songs and stories about noble knights falling deeply, hopelessly, beautifully in love with married women. Forbidden love. Untouchable love. The knight would pine for years, proving his devotion through impossible quests, never expecting to be with the woman he loved. This wasn't just art, it was psychological survival. It gave people an outlet for passion in a world that didn't allow love. But it also gave us something toxic, something that still lingers today, the idea that love should be tortured, that it must be dramatic, painful, and filled with longing to be real. That myth, that's medieval, and we're still dragging it into our modern lives, but we haven't even scratched the surface yet. Because if you thought all of this was grim, just wait until we talk about what it meant to try and fall in love in a world without bathing, without dentists, and with a church that believed even married sex was a sin. This is only the beginning. Let's keep going. As the pale light of morning stretched across crooked rooftops and winding, filthy alleys, medieval villagers began their routines, hauling water, tending fires, feeding livestock, and in these daily motions a brutal truth lingered. Love, even in its gentlest form, could be lethal. Because unlike today, where courtship might include awkward conversations or the occasional dating app disaster, in the Middle Ages, a romantic gesture could end in shame, exile, or even death. Let's begin with something as simple as physical proximity. Just walking beside someone you admired could stir suspicion. A lingering glance, a smile held too long. These were not innocent interactions. They could ruin your life. Privacy didn't exist. Most villagers lived in cramped one-room homes, shared by extended family and animals alike. Secrets were rare and gossip traveled faster than smoke. If you visited someone too often, too late, or looked too happy leaving their home, tongues would wag and consequences would follow. But physical affection, that was even more dangerous. Holding hands, kissing, sharing a blanket. These weren't romantic milestones, they were legal hazards. In many regions, if a couple was caught being intimate, even without actual intercourse, they could be forcibly married on the spot. Refusing could mean public punishment, or worse, social ruin. And if the girl was already promised to someone else, the consequences weren't just personal, they were political. Families might feud, alliances could crumble, blood could be spilled. You see, in a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or reliable doctors, emotions like love weren't viewed as tender or sacred. They were considered volatile, suspicious, even demonic. The church played a major role in shaping this fear. It taught that desire was a temptation of the flesh, a weakness to overcome. The holiest people, after all, were celibate monks and nuns. Marriage was tolerated, but never celebrated. Sex was permissible only within marriage, and only for procreation. Pleasure? That was sinful, especially if the woman enjoyed it. Medieval medical texts went even further. They described women as cold and moist, mentally unstable, and driven by a dangerous kind of lust. A woman who showed passion could be labeled possessed, or accused of seduction via sorcery. If a man fell helplessly in love, society might blame the woman for casting a spell or invoking dark forces. That's how deep the fear ran. Even small romantic tokens, like a lock of hair, a carved wooden charm, or a flower tucked into a letter, could be viewed as tools of witchcraft. Love, in this worldview, wasn't a force of beauty. It was something wild, something risky, something in need of control. But perhaps no group was more vulnerable than young women. Their bodies, their reputations, their futures were all policed relentlessly. A girl's value was tied to her chastity. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was economic capital. A bride with a clean reputation brought greater dowry value, one with rumors swirling around her, practically worthless. So when accusations arose, no matter how baseless, they stuck. Girls who were seen alone with boys, girls who spoke their minds, girls who laughed too loudly or looked too pretty, all became targets. Some were forced into early marriages to protect family honor. Others were locked away. A few, branded as witches, were punished far more severely. And the irony? Even married women weren't safe. Marriage didn't guarantee affection, safety, or freedom. In fact, many women found that the vows spoken on their wedding day were the beginning of lifelong control. A husband had the legal right to discipline his wife within reason. What counted as reason was up to him. Domestic violence wasn't hidden, it was expected. A bruised face or broken wrist didn't spark sympathy, it sparked silence. There were no shelters, no divorce, no recourse. Women were expected to endure, to obey, to bear children endlessly, regardless of risk. If they died in childbirth, and many did, it was chalked up to fate or God's will. And childbirth was terrifying. Without sanitation, sterile tools, or trained midwives, every delivery was a gamble. One infection, one breach, one torn artery, and both mother and child were gone. If a woman survived her first birth, she was often pregnant again within months. The cycle continued until she was either barren or buried. And all of this pain, this suffering, this systemic oppression was wrapped in the language of morality. The church insisted that this was the divine order, that women were made to suffer because of Eve's sin, that submission was holy, that resisting was unnatural. And so, generation after generation, people entered marriages with fear in their hearts. Even men, while wielding more power, were trapped by these norms. A second son might be pushed into the clergy, stripped of any romantic future. A nobleman might be forced to marry someone for a land deal. A peasant boy might fall in love, only to have his lord deny the match for economic reasons. And still, people loved, quietly, recklessly, hopelessly. They passed notes when they could, whispered through thin wooden walls, brushed fingers in passing, wrote poems, scratched initials into trees, slipped small tokens under doors. They loved knowing it might destroy them, knowing they might never be together. That, perhaps, is what makes medieval love stories so haunting. Because in a world built to crush emotion, the mere act of loving someone became an act of rebellion. It wasn't safe, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for those few who managed to hold onto their feelings, despite the rules, the fear, the punishment, their stories became legend. Not because they lived happily ever after. Most didn't, but because they dared to feel anyway. As we continue on, we'll see how this dangerous emotional undercurrent eventually became a system, a carefully constructed network of laws, customs, and religious dogma that treated love as a threat or as a transaction, a world that couldn't tolerate vulnerability, that feared passion, that twisted human connection into a weapon or a tool, because for medieval society, love was never just personal, it was political, it was spiritual, and it was almost always punished. 071-3. While clan feuds, religious repression, and rigid customs made everyday life unbearable, it was in the tender space of the heart, where love attempts to take root, that medieval society was most merciless. If you think modern dating is filled with landmines, imagine living in a world where a simple act of affection could condemn you as wicked, weak, or worse, supernatural. Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just risky, it was deeply suspect. The boundaries between emotion, illness, and magic were blurred. Passion could be mistaken for possession. Infatuation could be diagnosed as madness, and women, especially those who didn't conform, were the first to be accused of manipulating others with spells. You see, when logic failed, people turned to superstition. If a man became obsessed with a woman, it wasn't interpreted as chemistry, it was love sickness, a real medical diagnosis. Symptoms included insomnia, hallucinations, inability to eat, irrational behavior. The cure, bleeding, purging, or even isolation to break the enchantment. In this mindset, love itself became a disease, and the person you fell for, a potential source of contamination. This was particularly dangerous for women. A girl who was too pretty, too witty, or simply too different could easily be accused of using witchcraft to seduce a man. If her admirer fell ill or acted foolishly, people might whisper that she'd enchanted him, add in a dried herb pouch, a carved trinket, or a passing knowledge of midwifery, and the case was sealed. The church only fanned the flames. Sermons warned against women as temptresses. The tale of Eve's original sin was invoked constantly. Women were to be feared, watched, controlled. A woman's laughter might hide a lie. Her gaze might hold a curse. Even healing could be dangerous. Herbalists, often older women or widows, provided remedies for love pain, menstrual cramps, or childbirth. But their knowledge, passed down through generations, wasn't celebrated. It was seen as unholy. Their skills weren't medicinal, they were magical. And magic, of course, had to be punished. Thousands of women across medieval Europe were tried and executed for witchcraft. Many had done nothing more than offer a charm, read a fortune, or assist in a troubled labor. Others were caught in the crossfire of jealousy, power struggles, or moral panic. Their real crime? Living outside the bounds of obedience. Imagine a girl, 17 years old, who weaves rosemary into her hair before meeting her sweetheart, an old family tradition meant to bring clarity and peace. But when the boy falls ill days later, his mother accuses her of cursing him. The rosemary becomes evidence. The girl is seized, interrogated, tortured, burned. This wasn't a rare story. It was one of many. Even among royalty, fear of love magic ran deep. Kings and queens surrounded themselves with priests and witch sniffers to ensure their marriages were protected. Some believed infertility was the result of spells. Others thought that falling in love with someone beneath them must be the work of demonic interference. In this environment, real intimacy became almost impossible. Every affection was double-checked, every relationship monitored, letters were censored, gifts inspected. Courtship wasn't just fragile, it was terrifying. And if you dared to defy expectations, to fall for someone your family hadn't chosen, you risked everything: disinheritance, excommunication, banishment, even execution. In some cases, young lovers were imprisoned for attempting to marry without approval. A secret wedding could be annulled and punished. A runaway couple might be hunted down like criminals. Their union wasn't romantic, it was rebellion. Yet love endured. It whispered through the cracks of stone walls. It flickered in torchlight at secret meetings. It breathed in stolen moments. Glances in church, notes passed in bread loaves, flowers left on windowsills. It lived in the defiance of rules meant to extinguish it. Some lovers became legends, not because they succeeded, but because they dared. Think of Abelard and Heloise. Their forbidden affair, full of intellect, desire, and tragedy, shocked the church. He was castrated. She was sent to a convent. And yet, their letters survive, aching, eloquent, and full of impossible longing. Their story wasn't unique. It was just one that history happened to remember. Most love stories from this era ended in silence, in separation, in sacrifice. A girl forced to wed a man she didn't know. A boy who became a monk because his beloved was married off. Two hearts, once hopeful, torn apart by rules older than either of them. And still, they tried. They wrote poetry. They carved names into wood. They dreamed despite knowing the odds. Because even in a world built to destroy it, love refused to vanish. It wore disguises. It traveled in shadows. It endured through metaphor and myth, through music and prayer. And in doing so, it reminded people, then and now, that the human heart is stubborn, that even in the face of cruelty, control, and fear, people will always reach for each other. That's what makes medieval love stories so powerful. Not their happy endings, they rarely had any, but the sheer force of will it took to begin them at all. A kiss that could kill, a poem that might condemn, a glance that could lead to exile, and yet they still kissed, still wrote, still looked, because deep down, love was more than rebellion. It was resistance. In a world that offered no safety for tenderness, to feel was to fight, and those who fought quietly, desperately, endlessly, carved out a legacy not just of sorrow, but of courage, a legacy we still feel every time we choose connection in a world that doesn't always make room for it, a legacy of hearts that beat through history's darkest corridors, leaving light in their wake. If you thought the rigid marriage rules, cruel customs, and religious fear were the worst things about medieval romance, brace yourself. Because beyond arranged unions, lost agency, and fatal childbirths lay something even darker. A world where falling in love could brand you as dangerous, unholy, or cursed. Welcome to the realm of superstition. In medieval Europe, love wasn't just tricky, it was deeply suspicious. Sudden infatuation, probably sorcery. Longing that defied social boundaries, a sure sign of demonic interference. Romance wasn't viewed as a spark of human emotion. It was often believed to be magical. And not in the fairy tale way. Take love sickness, a real diagnosis in medieval medical texts. If a man couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, or became obsessed with a woman, it wasn't seen as emotional turmoil. It was a physical illness, something to be treated with herbs, purging, or even bloodletting. Passion was pathology, and if a woman was the object of that affection, especially if she was bold, clever, or beautiful, she could be accused of witchcraft, of casting a love spell, of ensnaring a man's will against his better judgment. Even something as harmless as braiding rosemary into her hair could turn into evidence. Rosemary was believed to enhance memory and affection, useful in courtship, but in the eyes of suspicious neighbors, a sure sign of manipulation. If the object of your affections suddenly became sick, irrational, or obsessed, you were the culprit, especially if you were a woman. Worse still, many of the remedies for lovesickness involved exorcism. In some cases, priests were summoned to drive out what they believed were lustful demons. If you seemed too in love, too attached, too emotionally intense, it meant you were spiritually compromised. Medieval culture didn't just discourage love. It actively medicalized, criminalized, and moralized it. Women bore the brunt of this suspicion. Midwives and herbalists, women who understood how to help other women, were often accused of using love magic, offering a charm to attract a partner, witchcraft, giving a tea to ease heartache or anxiety, sorcery, helping a pregnant woman deliver safely, clearly unnatural. Even healing became suspect if it came from a woman. The most tragic part, many of these women were targeted simply because they lived outside the norm. Widows, midwives, women without male protectors. Their independence made them dangerous. Their knowledge made them vulnerable. So when things went wrong, when a couple split, when a man strayed, when a marriage failed, blame often fell on the woman. She must have cursed him. She must have tempted him. She must have broken the natural order. and punishment followed. Some were dragged before village councils, others were beaten, many were imprisoned, a few were hanged or burned, all for daring to exist outside male control, or for trying to help others find comfort in love. Even weddings weren't free from this fear. Brides wore specific colors, not just for beauty, but to ward off evil. Herbs like rue and sage were woven into garlands to protect against curses. Iron trinkets were hidden in clothing to keep spirits away. The marriage bed was sometimes sprinkled with salt. The night itself was steeped in rituals designed to keep danger out and obedience in. But the fear didn't end at the altar. Women who delayed pregnancy were seen as suspicious. A childless bride might be accused of closing her womb with magic. If her husband died young, she could be accused of being cursed, or of cursing him. Women lived their entire lives, one misfortune, away from accusation. And the worst part? There was no way to prove innocence. Once suspicion took root, it grew like ivy. If a woman defended herself too forcefully, she was defiant. If she stayed quiet, she was hiding something. Her neighbor's gossip could become her death sentence. Even among nobles, romantic decisions were filtered through fear. A queen who failed to produce an heir might be accused of barrenness caused by sin. A king who lost interest in his wife might accuse her of enchantment. Affairs, betrayals, or infertility were rarely just emotional. They were often spun into spiritual or supernatural narratives. Because in a world with no understanding of biology, hormones, or psychology, everything had to be explained through God, or the devil, and love, with its intensity, unpredictability, and potential to disrupt carefully arranged lives, was often seen as the devil's favorite tool. And yet, somehow, people still loved. They still risked everything for it. They wrote secret letters in code, hid tokens in hollow trees, whispered in the dark. They defied their families, their churches, their governments. They ran away, eloped, or refused to marry altogether. They chose ruin over repression, and in doing so, they gave us some of the most tragic and beautiful stories in history. Because when love is forbidden, it becomes mythic. When tenderness is punishable, it becomes sacred. When holding someone's hand might mean losing everything, you hold tighter. These weren't just stories of rebellion. They were stories of resistance, and they live on in us, in the ways we cherish our freedom to love, in how we treasure the choice our ancestors never had, in our instinct to hold on to connection, even when it hurts. Perhaps that's why we still cry at Romeo and Juliet, why we still dream about soulmates, why we long for a love that feels fated, even if it comes with risk. Because for hundreds of years, people loved without safety, without approval, without even hope. And the fact that they did, that they fought for it, died for it, whispered it into being under the threat of fire, makes their stories not just tragic, it makes them human, and heartbreakingly beautiful. 5. Even as love clung to life beneath the crushing weight of fear, superstition, and control, the very act of pursuing it was often a perilous journey. Romance didn't begin with candlelight or roses. It began with risk, and not emotional risk, like awkward rejections or missed signals. No, in the medieval world, to court someone was to walk a tightrope suspended above ruin. For many, courtship began with a glance, a whispered compliment, a small gift, but any of these could spiral into disaster. A smile in church might stir gossip. A touch of the hand might be reported. If a chaperone wasn't present, if someone was seen leaving a home too late, the assumption wasn't flirtation, it was sin. And once you were thought to have sinned, the punishment came fast. In many communities, couples caught in acts of affection, even mild ones, were dragged before local courts or shamed in public squares. A forced marriage could be arranged to fix the damage. Refusal could mean banishment, imprisonment, or being branded for life. And women, as always, bore the heavier cost. A girl labeled as fallen lost everything: her reputation, her marriage prospects, her family's honor. Some were sent to convents, others into forced labor. Some simply vanished, discarded by the very people meant to protect them. To protect their daughters, families placed them under near-constant surveillance. Noble girls were kept in guarded towers or monasteries. Peasant daughters were married off young, before love could complicate things. But even under watchful eyes, affection bloomed. Enter bundling, a strange and surprisingly widespread practice in parts of Northern Europe. In bundling, a courting couple would be allowed to lie beside each other in bed, fully clothed, sometimes with a board between them, sometimes sewn into separate sleeping sacks. The idea was to foster closeness without risk. The reality, predictably different. In many cases, bundling led to premarital sex, pregnancies, and hurried weddings. And for girls whose families couldn't afford a quick fix, the consequences were devastating. A child born out of wedlock was a lifelong stain. Even a false rumor could destroy a girl's life. Virginity wasn't just a concept, it was currency. Men, too, were bound by brutal expectations. To be worthy of a woman's hand, especially in noble circles, a man often had to prove his value in combat. Tournaments, duels, and feats of bravery were all ways to gain favor. But these weren't romantic games. They were bloody, dangerous contests. Jousting with wooden lances still caused shattered bones. Real duels could be fatal. Men lost eyes, limbs, or their lives trying to impress a lady who might never even speak to them. Even among the lower classes, love wasn't free. Peasant men who married without a lord's permission could be fined, evicted, or forced into military service. A man who eloped with a woman from another estate might find himself hunted. Love was not a reason, it was a rebellion. And if you thought things calmed down after marriage, they didn't. The wedding night was no sanctuary. For many women, it was terrifying. Some brides were as young as 12 or 13, married to much older men. Most had no understanding of sex, and even less control over what happened to them. Consent wasn't a legal requirement. A husband had full rights to his wife's body, forever, and if that first night led to pregnancy, so began the cycle of childbirth, again and again, each time risking death. There were no trained obstetricians, no pain relief, no antibiotics. A woman might survive one labor, only to die in the next, or the baby would die, or both. And if she survived them all, she might be left with long-term damage, physical and emotional. The home was no refuge either. Domestic abuse was accepted, even encouraged. A husband was expected to control his wife, and physical punishment was his tool. There were no protections, no safe havens. The law offered no help. Religion demanded patience and silence. Divorce? Almost impossible. A woman who fled her husband lost everything. Her children, her home, her name. Unless she could pay to enter a convent, an expensive option, her only hope was to disappear entirely. And still, people kept loving. They wrote poems, sang songs, carved hearts into walls, risked everything for a moment of connection. Because what choice did they have? To feel nothing was to survive, but to feel something truly, deeply, was to be alive. There's a haunting kind of bravery in that. Even with swords drawn, sickness looming, and shame waiting in the shadows, people still reached for each other, still tried, still hoped, and in doing so they left behind stories that echo through centuries, not because they triumphed, but because they dared to try. To love in the medieval world wasn't to fall gently, it was to fall hard, fast, and often alone. And yet, again and again, they did. So when we complain today about dry texts, awkward silences, or flaky dates, remember this. At least we won't be burned, beaten, or exiled for the act of loving someone. And that freedom, though fragile, was bought by generations of quiet courage, by people who risked not just broken hearts, but broken bones, who chased the flicker of connection through fire, silence, and fear, who taught us that love, even in the worst of times, is always worth the risk. 071-2006. To bring this long journey to a close, let's take one final, quiet breath together. We've walked through a world where love was not a right, but a risk, where every stolen glance and whispered word came with consequences far beyond heartbreak. And yet, people still loved. And that's something worth remembering. In medieval times, love was radical, not in the sense of rebellion through banners and battles, but through feeling, simply feeling. Longing, tenderness, devotion. In a world built to suppress emotion, where nearly every institution tried to regulate, punish, or redirect desire, the act of loving someone freely was almost an act of defiance. Imagine growing up in a world where your spouse is chosen before you reach puberty, where the idea of choosing a partner based on compatibility, shared laughter, or genuine attraction is laughable, where marriage is a contract, your body a commodity, your love irrelevant, and yet you fall. Maybe it starts with a smile at market, or a song shared across a courtyard, a borrowed book, a late-night conversation beneath candlelight. You start to feel something warm, something terrifying. You know it's dangerous, but you keep feeling anyway. You're not alone. Across generations, thousands lived this same story. They lived under the weight of arranged marriages, religious expectations, crushing gender roles, and the ever-present threat of disease, war, and loss. Yet they dared to reach out. They dared to feel. Some wrote letters hidden in hems and sleeves. Others carved initials into trees. A few ran away and risked everything, family, name, security, for a chance at happiness, however brief. And while most of those stories ended quietly or tragically or in complete obscurity, they mattered, deeply. Because they remind us that love, true, messy, imperfect love, is older than law, older than kings, older than any sacred text. It existed long before anyone tried to control it, and it always finds a way to survive, even in the harshest of climates. In many ways, modern romance, with all its messiness, its awkward beginnings, its miscommunications and mistakes, is a privilege our ancestors never had. We complain about unanswered texts, disappointing dates, and emotional confusion. But we live in a world where love, for the most part, is free. Where we can say no, or say yes, where consent matters, where passion doesn't equal punishment. That freedom, that's new. And we owe it to the countless people who came before us, who loved without permission, who hoped without guarantee, who endured centuries of silence, separation, and suffering in order to feel even a flicker of warmth. Maybe that's why medieval love stories still haunt us, not because of the gowns and castles, the knights and poetry, but because they're echoes of something raw, something real, a desperate need for closeness in a world designed to keep people apart. When we watch two lovers pulled apart by duty, or imagine a girl waiting at a tower window, or read about a forbidden kiss in a candlelit church, we feel something ancient stirring, because deep down we know love shouldn't have to fight so hard, but when it does, and still survives, it becomes something sacred. So tonight, as you drift off, think of them. The silent lovers, the ones who dared to feel, the girl who hid her heart under layers of fabric, the boy who carved his hopes into bark, the widow who found solace in secret letters, the monk who cried over a poem he never sent, the knight who fought not for glory, but for a glimpse of someone he was never allowed to touch. Their love might not have lasted, but it existed. And in that existence, they changed something. They kept the flame alive, even in the wind. And perhaps that's what love truly is. Not just joy or passion, not even lasting companionship, but persistence. The quiet, stubborn refusal to let the heart go numb. You are part of that story now. Every time you choose honesty over convenience, vulnerability over silence, every time you say, I care, in a world that often teaches us not to, you carry that ancient courage inside you. So let yourself feel, let yourself dream, let yourself hope, because no matter the time or place, whether in a cold stone castle or a tiny studio apartment, the heart wants the same thing: to be seen, to be held, to be loved, and to love in return. And that's never gone out of fashion. Good night.